Before you listen to this story, please take a deep breath and prepare your heart. This is the heartbreaking and deeply emotional journey of Sarah Miller, a young woman whose entire childhood was built and secrets, silence, and shame. On the outside, she smiled like every other teenager. But behind that smile was a world of pain no one dared to see. What happened to Sarah and just her story, it's a reflection of what many girls face in silence. If you've ever been ignored, hurt, or abandoned, her journey will echo in your soul. Subscribe now to support real stories like this. Her scream was silent, but now the world will hear. From the outside, Sarah Miller looked like the kind of girl who had everything: neat blonde ponytail, straight report cards, polite yes ma'am and no sir manners. The kind of smile that made teachers proud and neighbors nod with approval. But behind that carefully practiced smile was a war zone that no one saw. A battlefield that started long before she knew what war even meant. Her house in Savannah, Georgia looked picture perfect: white picket fence, green lawn. A mother who volunteered at church and a father who coached Little League. But when the lights went out and the front door locked, the roles shifted and Sarah became something else, something smaller, something silent. Her father, Peter Miller, was a respected dentist in town, known for his calm demeanor and quiet strength. But behind closed doors, that calm became cold, and that strength became suffocating. And it started with glances too long to fix, then touches masked as affection, then the whispers at night when no one was around. And Sarah, barely 10, learned to freeze her body like stone, pretending she didn't exist because existing meant pain. Her mother, Carol, always looked the other way, too busy baking cookies for church fundraisers or organizing the neighborhood cleanup to notice, or maybe she noticed but couldn't bear the truth. And so she let Sarah carry it alone. School became her escape, a place where she could pretend, where she could smile and laugh and write essays about happy homes and pretend that nightmares didn't chase her even when the sun was out. And the scariest part was how easy it became to pretend, to lie, to smile so wide her cheeks hurt while her heart ached for someone to just ask, really ask, "Are you okay?" But no one did. And by the time she turned 13, the pain had nested inside her like a second heart beating, bleeding, but hidden behind straight posture and tidy braids. And even when the bruises started to show, just faint ones, the kind you could explain away, people believed her excuses, because no one wanted to believe the truth about families that looked like hers. And when she finally told a friend at school, trembling in the locker room, whispering through tears what was happening to her, the friend blinked and said, "No way, your dad, he's like the nicest guy ever." And in that moment, Sarah learned the most dangerous thing about abuse wasn't the pain, it was the disbelief. So she stopped talking, stopped hoping, started building a shell so hard even she couldn't recognize her reflection. And nights became longer, colder, quieter, filled with muffled sobs into a pillow she named Hope, the only thing she felt she could hold. And every time he came into her room, she stared at the ceiling and counted backwards from 100, like maybe if she got to 0, it would all disappear. But it never did, and years passed like that, one silent scream after another, one shattered piece at a time. And by 16, Sarah had mastered the art of invisibility, of survival, of being the girl no one worried about, because she never caused trouble, never made noise, never asked for anything, until one night, after a school play, she met someone who would change everything, not by rescuing her, but by seeing her. And that tiny flicker of recognition in his eyes would be the spark she needed to finally face the fire. The boy's name was Noah Jameson Tull. Quiet, the kind of guy who blended into corners and sketchbooks, always wearing headphones and doodling on his jeans with a black Sharpie. But he had these eyes, deep and still, like he'd seen too much too young. And when Sarah stepped outside the auditorium doors that night, cheeks still pink from stage makeup, he was leaning against the wall, sketchpad in hand, and without even looking up, he said softly, "You were good, but you're Smile doesn't match your eyes. And those 10 words unraveled something inside her so suddenly she almost forgot how to breathe. No one had ever noticed. Not really. Not like that. Not with that strange combination of gentleness and certainty. And before she could stop herself, she laughed a short, sharp sound that felt like it belonged to someone else and walked away, without replying, afraid that if she stayed, she'd cry. But Noah didn't push, didn't chase, just nodded and let her go. And yet the next day, he sat beside her at lunch without asking, sketching quietly and offering her half of his orange, without saying a word. And it was that silence safe, non-invasive, study that began to chip away at her armor. They didn't talk about big things at first, just favorite movies, books, weird dreams, music that made them feel something when everything else felt numb. And slowly, she found herself waiting for his text at night, the one that just said you, okay, with a single sunflower emoji that became their private code for I'm here if you need me. And somehow, that was enough for now, because even though she hadn't told him the truth, not yet, his presence became her lighthouse, guiding her through nights that still broke her into pieces. And the more he showed up, the more she wondered if maybe she wasn't invisible after all. But secrets don't like the light. And the closer she got to safety, the more her father sensed something was slipping. And that's when the punishments started to change from quiet manipulations to explosive rage. Shattered dishes, yanked hair, cruel whispers hissed into her ear like poison. And every time he heard her, he ended with the same cold words. No one would ever believe you, Sarah. You're nothing without this family. And for years, she had believed that. Let those words live in her bones like truth. But now there was a voice inside her that whispered back, maybe he's wrong. And it was that tiny rebellion, that faint heartbeat of doubt, that kept her from collapsing completely. She started writing journals full of unsent letters, drawings of cages and broken clocks and hands reaching out of mirrors, and one day, Noah saw a glimpse of a sketch falling from her bag, picked it up and asked gently, this yours? She nodded, frozen, and he just said, it's beautiful, but it hurts. And she knew he meant you're beautiful, but you're hurting. And for the first time, she didn't lie, didn't deflect, she just nodded again and whispered, yeah, it does. That night, she cried like a storm had broken inside her, a shaking, body-wrecking kind of sobbing she hadn't allowed herself in years. And when her mother knocked on the door and asked if she was okay, she just said she was sick because, in a way, she was. Sick of pretending, sick of bleeding in silence, sick of wearing a mask so heavy she forgot what her real face felt like. And when Noah asked if she wanted to hang out at the lake the next weekend, she hesitated, but something in her said yes, even if her father said no, even if it meant sneaking out, even if it meant breaking a rule. Because for once, she wanted to feel like a normal girl instead of a haunted one. The day at the lake was the first time she really laughed in what felt like years, throwing rocks into the water, eating melted M&Ms, lying on the dock and talking about constellations and comic books. And when Noah reached over and touched her pinky with his, not a grab, not a grip, just a gentle link, she didn't flinch. And in that moment, under the soft Georgia sun, Sarah realized something that terrified and thrilled her all at once. She wasn't ready to die anymore. And that meant maybe, just maybe, she was ready to live. After the lake, something shifted inside Sarah, not overnight, not with fireworks, but like ice melting in slow drips, and freezing parts of her that had been locked in survival for so long she forgot they were there. And every moment with Noah felt like warm light against that ice. But healing, she learned, was not a straight line. It was jagged and unpredictable. And the safer she felt with Noah, the more dangerous home became. Like her father could smell her growing strength and needed to crush it before it bloomed. The abuse escalated, not always in bruises, but in threats, mind games, surveillance. The way he checked her phone when she wasn't looking, or cornered her in the kitchen and whispered things that made each her skin crawl. And when she tried to pull away, tried to reclaim just 1 inch of her own body. His fury turned volcanic, and one night he slammed her bedroom door so hard the hinges cracked, and Sarah knew he was losing control. And that made him unpredictable, lethal even. She began carrying pepper spray in her backpack, hid a burner phone under her mattress, started writing down everything, dates, times, words, because some part of her was preparing, not for escape, but for war. Still, she didn't tell Noah the full truth, not yet, not because she didn't trust him, but because saying it aloud would make it real, and real still terrified her. But then, one night, while they sat in his car with the windows fogged from their breath and music low in the background, he turned to her and said, "I know something's wrong, Sarah. I don't need details. I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere." And those words, so simple, so steady, landed like an anchor in her chest, grounding her in a way nothing else ever had. And so she began, in pieces, starting with the small things, that her house wasn't as happy as it looked, that sometimes her dad got angry, that she felt scared a lot, and Noah never pressed, never asked for more than she could give, just listened with his whole body, as if her pain deserved space, not shame. And one night, when she finally said the words, "He touches me," Noah froze, tears brimming in his eyes. But he didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't offer pity or false promises. He just said, "That's not your fault, and we're going to figure this out together." And for the first time, Sarah believed that maybe she wasn't broken to be saved. But telling Noah was only the beginning, because secrets that live in the dark don't die quietly, and once that truth left her lips, it was like a door had opened in her chest that couldn't be closed again. The next week, after another silent dinner where her father smiled at her like nothing had ever happened, she slammed her fork down, stood up, and walked out, heart pounding, hands shaking. But she didn't stop, not even when he called her name, not even when her mother shouted, "Sarah, don't you dare walk away," because she was done playing pretend, done swallowing screams, done painting pretty smiles over rotting wounds. She ran to the only place that felt safe, Noah's house, and when his mom opened the door and saw her tear-streaked face, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Can I please stay here tonight?" She didn't ask questions, just pulled Sarah into a hug that made her crumble. The next morning, they went to the school counselor, then to the police, and suddenly everything moved fast. Interviews, statements, hospital exams, social workers. Her father arrested, her mother crying on the front lawn yelling that Sarah was ruining their family. And in the chaos of it all, Sarah almost folded, almost ran back to the familiarity of silence, but Noah held her hand through every step, through every courtroom visit, through every breakdown, and reminded her, over and over, "You didn't ruin anything, you're saving yourself." But the world isn't kind to girls who tell the truth, especially when that truth threatens a man with a good reputation, and rumors spread fast. Kids whispering in hallways. Adults saying things like, "Is she sure? He was such a great guy." And Sarah felt the weight of disbelief pressing down like a second kind of abuse. But this time she didn't run, she stood up, chin high, voice cracking but loud, and told her story on a school assembly stage during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, ending her speech with, "I may have been silenced once, but I will never be silent again." And when she walked off that stage, the applause wasn't just noise, it was survival echoing through the hearts of everyone who finally saw her for who she was, not a victim, but a fighter. The courtroom was cold, not physically, but emotionally, with beige walls and polished floors that smelled like old wood and nerves. And as Sarah sat on the witness stand in her navy blue dress, hands trembling slightly, she looked out across the room and saw her father, calm, composed, in a press suit with a lawyer who smiled too easily, and her mother, eyes rimmed red, but not from sadness for Sarah, from embarrassment, from betrayal. Because in her eyes, Sarah wasn't the daughter anymore, she was the enemy, the one who dared to shatter their illusion of perfection. The prosecutor had warned her that this would be hard, that defense attorneys were skilled at poking holes in pain, but nothing could have prepared her for how it felt to be questioned like a liar. Like her trauma was a puzzle missing pieces. She'd already bled to provide, and when they asked, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. "Because I was a child. Because I was scared. Because every time I tried, someone told me to smile and be grateful." But instead, she looked at the jury and said clearly, "Because I didn't think anyone would believe me until I finally decided to believe myself." And that sentence hung in the air like thunder. Noah sat behind her every day of the trial, a silent force of strength, fingers tapping his knee with anxious rhythm. And when it was all over, when the jury filed back and the foreman said guilty, Sarah didn't cry, not then, not in front of the cameras, not while her father was handcuffed and taken away, but later. That night, sitting on the floor of Noah's living room with her head in his lap and her body finally letting go, she sobbed for everything she'd lost and everything she'd survived and everything she might finally become. And that was the beginning, not the end, because even though the man who hurt her was gone, the echoes weren't, and the road to healing wasn't paved with flowers. It was full of potholes and sharp turns, and some mornings she still woke up gasping from dreams of locked doors and heavy footsteps. But now she had tools, real ones, therapy twice a week, a journal she actually wrote in, a playlist of music that made her feel strong, and the growing knowledge that her body belonged to her, not to anyone else. She started college in the fall, a small liberal arts school out of state, where no one knew her past unless she chose to share it. And for the first time, she felt like a girl in control, not a girl being controlled. She dyed her hair auburn, got a small tattoo of a cracked heart with sunflowers blooming out of it, and joined a campus support group for survivors where she spoke on a panel about resilience, where a freshman girl came up to her afterward and said, "Your words made me feel like I wasn't alone." And Sarah smiled, not the practiced, perfect smile she used to wear, but a real one, soft and honest. Because she understood now that survival wasn't about forgetting, it was about choosing what comes next. Noah visited every other weekend, and their love, though still young, was quiet and steady, built on more than trauma, built on shared jokes and late-night calls, and the way he remembered her coffee order and never once asked her to be anyone but herself. And when the holidays came round, and she chose not to go home, her and her mother's estranged sister invited her to stay instead. And Sarah found herself sitting at a new table with people who didn't ask for stories she wasn't ready to tell, who just passed the potatoes and asked about her classes and made her laugh until her stomach hurt. And one night, curled up in bed, she pulled out the old stuffed bear from her childhood, the one she'd hidden under her bed for years, and whispered, "We made it." And something in her heart finally clicked into place, like a puzzle piece she didn't know was missing. And still, there were hard days, flashbacks, triggers, panic attacks in the middle of class, but now she knew how to ride the waves instead of drowning in them. And she knew healing wasn't about never breaking again, it was about knowing she could rebuild every time. And as spring rolled in, Sarah stood on stage again, this time at a campus rally for survivor advocacy, microphone in hand, heart steady, and said, "They tried to break me. They failed. I am not what they did. I am what I've chosen to become." And the crowd rose, not in sympathy, but in solidarity, because her voice wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every girl who'd ever been told to sit down, shut up, and smile while they suffered. And now it was loud enough to be heard around the world. College didn't just give Sarah a fresh start, it gave her a mission, a voice she once thought was too shattered to be heard, now echoing through classrooms, student halls, online forums, and national panels. And though she never sought fame, her story began to spread, first through her university's survivor newsletter, then a podcast interview, then a short video clip from the campus rally that went viral, her voice shaking as she said, "Healing isn't about forgetting, it's about surviving loud enough to remind others they can too." And suddenly, inboxes flooded with messages from girls across the country, even overseas, girls who had never told anyone before, girls who whispered their pain through trembling fingers and asked, "How did you survive?" And Sarah, still learning, still healing, still stumbling sometimes through panic and memory, answered the only way she knew how, with honesty, not perfection. She launched a blog called The Lies Behind Her Smile, posting weekly reflections, poetry, and resources, therapist directories, safety plans, legal facts, and journal prompts that began with "You are not to blame." And it became a safe space, not just for survivors, but for those who loved them, those who wanted to help but didn't know how, and soon. Sarah was invited to speak at trauma conferences, school districts, women's shelters, even police departments, places that once would have terrified her, but now gave her purpose. And though each time she told her story, it scraped her raw, she did it anyway, because she knew that somewhere, in every audience sat a girl who still thought she was alone, still believed the lie that silence was safer than truth, and Sarah refused to let that lie live another day. But advocacy wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was exhausting, triggering, lonely, and on those days, she unplugged, retreated, took long walks without her phone, let Noah cook her dinner and rub her shoulders in silence, watched bad comedies until the lump in her throat softened again, and nowhere, always steady, always present, never asked her to slow down, but always reminded her he was her pause when the world demanded play, her anchor when her past tried to unmoor her, and together they built a kind of quiet joy she once thought she'd never know. Their love didn't look like fairy tales, it looked like middle-of-the-night grounding exercises, and love letters left in textbooks, and emergency chocolate in the glove box, and sometimes holding each other through nightmares that still visited uninvited. But Sarah wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. She had learned how to walk through it, how to light her own path and carry a torch for others. And as her senior year began, she decided to turn her blog into something bigger, a nonprofit, built by survivors, for survivors, offering not just stories, but shelter, scholarships, therapy grants, and a legal support hotline that never closed. She named it Smile Survivors, Making Impact, leading empowerment, because the smile she once used to hide pain now stood for something greater: strength, movement, integrity, life, and empathy. And when the launch event came, held in a small auditorium filled with friends, supporters, counselors, and survivors, Sarah stepped up to the podium in a pale blue blazer, her sunflower necklace shining against her collarbone, and took a deep breath. "When I was 10, she began, voice clear, I thought my life would end in silence. But now, I know my voice can begin someone else's." And when she finished, the standing ovation didn't feel like applause, it felt like every silent scream that had ever lived in her chest finally exhaling. Months later, she was invited to speak before Congress. Months later, she was invited to speak before Congress during a national summit on sexual abuse reform, standing beside survivors from all walks of life: military, foster care, sports, schools. And as cameras flashed and microphones leaned in, she didn't feel small anymore. She felt rooted, like every step, every scream, every scar had led to this moment. And when she stood there, palms slightly sweaty, knees shaking behind the podium, she looked up and imagined every 10-year-old girl out there who was still trapped in her own private nightmare. And she spoke directly to them: "You are not invisible, you are not broken, you are not to blame, and the world needs your truth more than it needs its comfort." And those words made headlines not because they were shocking, but because they were finally being heard. The bill passed 2 months later, a bipartisan Survivor Protection Act named the Miller Law, and Sarah cried alone in her dorm when she saw her name etched in legislation, not for the fame, not for the victory, but for the 10-year-old inside her who once thought she wouldn't make it to 20. And while her name grew, her life stayed quiet. Noah moved in with her after graduation, and their apartment smelled like eucalyptus and hope, with notes on the fridge like "Today was hard. I'm proud of you, and art from survivor kids, pinned to the walls like medals. She got a dog, a rescued golden retriever named Justice, who snored too loud and followed her everywhere. And when she adopted him, the shelter worker smiled and said, "He's a little damaged, but less. Hell?" And Sarah grinned, replying, "Aren't we all?" Her days became filled with writing, public speaking, training social workers, building digital trauma courses, and Zoom calls with global survivor networks Uganda, Brazil, Ukraine, Japan, where women shared their own versions of her pain, their own stolen childhoods, their own battles for healing. And every time, Sarah told them, "You are not alone. You never were." And slowly, the girl who once begged the ceiling to swallow her now stood tall in rooms where power had always worn suits and silence, daring them to listen up because she was special, but because she survived, and survival was her greatest credential. And yet, she never forgot where it started: the cracked bedroom door, the whispered threats, the lonely walk to the counselor's office, and that memory made her gentle, especially with new survivors, especially with young girls who didn't yet have words, only tears. And when she met them, she sat on floors instead of chairs, held space instead of hands, and said softly, "Take your time. I'm not leaving." Just like Noah once did for her. And one day, years into her work, she received a letter in the mail handwritten, shaky, and when she opened it, her heart stopped. It was from her mother. The words weren't perfect, apologies rarely are, but they were real, raw, trembling, with regret and late blooming love. And though forgiveness wasn't easy, Sarah found it not because her mother deserved it, but because she herself deserved the peace of letting go. And that night, sitting on her balcony, sunset in her eyes, dog curled at her feet, Noah humming a soft song from the kitchen, Sarah whispered to the sky, "You didn't win, Dad. You'll never win." And she smiled, not a mask, not a defense mechanism, but a real, wide, holy smile. And it wasn't a lie anymore. It was her truth. And it was beautiful. Fame never interested Sarah, not the way it fascinated others, because for her, every interview, every award, every headline was just another doorway to a locked room where someone else was trapped, waiting for a voice to unlock it. And as her nonprofit smile expanded globally, building trauma recovery centers in underfunded schools, launching an emergency housing app for runaway survivors, and publishing survivor-authored books, Sarah refused to become a symbol. She insisted on remaining human, flawed, growing, still attending therapy, still writing in the same beat-up journal that once caught her tears in ink. And though she was now considered one of the most influential young advocates in the country, she still made time to meet with survivors, one-on-one, teen moms, foster teens, and documented girls, because she believed real change didn't happen on stages. It happened in quiet rooms where truth could breathe. But with expansion came resistance, critics calling her too emotional, politicians trying to get her funding, and even online trolls who questioned her story, who dug up old photos and school records to find cracks in her past. But Sarah, once terrified of being doubted, now stood tall, answering lies with facts, hate with truth, and fear with fire. She became a lighthouse for thousands. But lighthouses don't move, they stand in the storm, burning, guiding, never resting. And some nights, she broke down from the weight of it all, curled in Noah's arms, whispering, "Am I doing enough?" To which he always replied, "You're doing more than the world deserves." And on the hardest days, she let herself cry, not because she was weak, but because even warriors bleed when they fight this long. And then, one fall evening, a girl named Malia entered her life, her 14-year-old with bruises older than her braces, taken from a foster home after her third suicide attempt. And Sarah saw her, really saw her, saw the hollow in her eyes, the tightness in her jaw, and knew, without words, that Malia was who she once was. She became Malia's mentor, her emergency contact, her legal guardian months later. And though Sarah never thought she'd be a mother, she found pieces of herself in Malia's healing, and in teaching her to trust, to speak, to breathe without flinching. Sarah's own healing deepened. They planted a sunflower garden together, adopted a second dog, started a survivor podcast called The Quiet Ones Are Loud Now, and on Malia's 16th birthday, she gave Sarah a framed quote that read, "You didn't just save my life, you taught me how to live it," and Sarah cried for an hour, not from sadness, but from the beautiful ache of purpose fulfilled. By the time Sarah turned 30, her story had been turned into a memoir, a documentary, and even a college course syllabus. But what mattered most to her wasn't what people said about her. It was the stories that others began to tell because of her. Survivors who once sat in the dark now stood in light, running for office, starting their own nonprofits, becoming therapists, artists, healers, leaders, and all of them carried a piece of Sarah's fire inside them. At an international women's summit in Geneva, she was introduced not by her accolades, but by a girl from Nepal who said, "If Sarah's voice hadn't reached my village, I would not be alive today." And when Sarah took the stage, she didn't speak about trauma. She spoke about becoming more than what was done to you, about building futures so wide they eclipse the past. But even as her professional world soared, her personal life remained tender, deeply rooted. Noah proposed under their sunflower arch, with Malia hiding the ring in Sarah's journal. And their wedding was small, quiet, filled with laughter and tears, held in the community center that once hosted Sarah's very first rally. And that night, dancing barefoot with her husband, her daughter laughing in the background, Sarah whispered, "This is the life I never thought I'd get, and I will never take a second of it for granted." She continued her work but began shifting from frontline advocacy to leadership, training younger survivors to rise, to take the mic, to design the solutions they needed. And her board meetings started opening with breathing exercises and closing with gratitude circles. Because, as she always said, we are not just here to fix systems, we're here to heal souls. And one day, standing in front of a packed university auditorium, she ended her talk with this: "They tried to bury me in silence. What they didn't know was I was soil, and I grew." And the students wept not because it was sad, but because it was true. Years passed, as they always do, and Sarah aged with grace, not untouched by her past, but deeply shaped by it, her scars softening into wisdom, her story transforming from tragedy to testimony. She was invited to light the torch at the National Survivor Monument in Washington, D.C., a sculpture made of shattered mirrors that reflected the faces of those who survived. And as she touched the flame to the wick, Malia stood beside her, now a college senior in social justice, and whispered, "Mom, you made the world safer." And Sarah turned, tears in her eyes, replying, "No, baby, we did." Her name was etched into legislation, museum walls, and even high school textbooks. But in the quiet of her home, she was just Sarah, gardener, dog lover, wife, mother, mentor, someone who learned how to turn pain into purpose, silence into song. And when her first grandchild was born, and she held that baby girl in her arms, she whispered, "You will never know the darkness I knew, because we burned it down." And when Sarah passed many years later, peacefully in her sleep, the world did not fall silent. It rose, with candlelight vigils in 63 countries, murals in her honor, girls and women gathering in circles reading her story aloud like scripture. Her nonprofit became a global force, renamed the Sarah Miller Foundation for Justice, and every year on her birthday, schools around the world taught a single lesson called the power of telling the truth. And in that truth, Sarah lived on, not as a victim, not even just a survivor, but as a woman who turned her scream into a movement, her tears into fire, her brokenness into a bridge, and in doing so, gave the world not just her smile, but her soul. Thanks for watching my videos. Please subscribe to my channel.